Walker, who's hot, who's a bit warm around the edges and feeling sleepy at the moment. A little bit mid-afternoon. I just want to check everybody's awake, so I'm going to do a test. When my hands pass, I want you to clap. Just once, just once. A bit premature at the front here. Let's try again. Thank you very much, that's very kind of you. I would, of course, say to my learned friend that cargo is always the innocent party, with my Clyde & Co hat on. I'm sure that, by and large, I have an audience of rabid ship owner representatives, and therefore I'm honoured to be given the opportunity to speak to you. I will be talking about the idea of, in the casualty scenario, is the cargo always the innocent party? I've acted on some of the headline casualties of the last 20 years, and by and large I always find at some point or other one of the ship owner firms will point the finger in my client's direction and say it was their fault. I would start by saying that there is an element of ironic timing going on in terms of we are just approaching the first anniversary of the unfortunately named MSC Flaminia going up in flames in the Atlantic, and only last Monday the Mole Comfort broke her back in what might be considered unremarkable sea conditions, and salvors are currently trying to grapple with both ends and take her to a place of safety. I was involved heavily with the MSC Napoli casualty of 6 years ago, when the Napoli broke her back in the Channel in unremarkable sea conditions and was towed by French salvors initially into the English waters. I fancy if it had been English salvors initially, they may have towed her into French waters. I want to have a look at how cargo can have a role in the following. Have a role in these casualty scenarios, and what sort of blame is put in our direction. I will be looking at issues of container weights and the weighing of containers. You may have seen in the press that there is speculation on the internet, by and large, that the Mole Comfort may have broken her back due to some issue with container weights. I will touch on issues of how containerisation has resulted in the world we live in to some degree, and how speed over safety, in my own personal opinion, seems to be playing a role in some of the major casualties that we have seen in recent times. And then I will finish with a quick thought about where the future may be. You can stay right here, I'm just pressing the button. Let's just touch briefly on the Mole Comfort, since it is in the headlines. These vessels sometimes have ironic names, and the failure of the hull will be no comfort to any underwriters involved, whether it be cargo underwriters or hull underwriters, or indeed maybe in due course P&I. I suspect that salvors are the only ones rubbing their hands with glee. The weather conditions reported as being fairly heavy, but waves of 6 to 7 metres, which means that on a mean average wave height you might expect waves of somewhere 11 to 12 as the exceptional level of the wave. This vessel was 5 years old. You would imagine that she'd probably encountered those weather conditions previously. We're looking potentially at bending moments issues. For those non-scientific in the audience, as I'm non-scientific, and I learned this all from scratch on the Napoli, the bending moments of the vessel is effectively the vessel going wang, 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 like that. It is a combination of the design of the vessel taken in conjunction with the allocation of the weight across the length of the vessel, and then you apply that to the weather and wave conditions, and she effectively bends up and down around a midpoint. If the vessel exceeds her permitted bending moments, you will find that she will suffer a catastrophic hull failure. By and large, vessels that are having a bending moment issue suffer a sagging failure, whereby the two ends go upwards, as opposed to what we see in the pictures of the Mold Comfort, and we saw in the Napoli, which was a hogging failure where the ends drop. There are already speculation on the internet that you may have had an issue with container weights and container weight distribution. The idea that somebody somewhere may have got the cargo planning or the cargo declarations wrong, such that the vessel had a large amount of weight either fore or aft. That would seem, from a distant perspective, reasonably unlikely. Otherwise, in the still waters of the last load port, you would have expected draft measurements to have revealed a problem. That is not to say that we may not be looking at ballast distribution issues as contributing, and movement of ballast post leaving the last load port. There is also speculation that is in the public domain that the Comfort was built with a particular high tensile steel that has only had limited application to her, and I think it's about 20 vessels built in Korea. Other factors, I will come back to other factors in due course when I touch on the Napoli investigation. So let's have a look. I'm going to run through each of these. By and large, the major types of casualty, the one I don't touch on is groundings, because generally I don't think that cargo is likely to contribute to a grounding. Explosions and fires, often the first finger is pointed in the direction of a cargo. Hull failures, we'll touch on container weight and weight distribution, and sinkings. Again, container weight and weight distribution have been cited as an issue even on container ships. We'll probably be aware of the liquefaction type cases where cargo is blamed as well. With my cargo hat on, being evangelical about cargo, I often ask the question, is it the cargo alone? Is there some other factor at play that contributes towards the casualty? I'm usually looking at it from an unseaworthiness perspective, and with my cargo hat on, I am looking for a 1% contribution from some causative unseaworthiness, and therefore I am always interested in the way in which the ship owner or the carriers have interacted with the cargo that is said to be at fault. So I'm always looking for what we describe as the X factor. I'm going back over there now. I'm just conscious that the pillars give poor lines of sight, so I just want to make sure that most people don't have to put up with looking at me the whole time. Calcium hypochlorite is one of the classic examples of a cargo that has been identified as the cause of a number of casualties, and there we can list off four of the biggest: the Aconcagua, the CMA Jakarta, the Conchit France, and the DG Harmony. Calcium hypochlorite for those who are not aware, and I would imagine that most people have come across it or read about it at some point, is effectively a cleaning agent. I believe is used to clean swimming pools, is its number one use, and it is a chemical that becomes incredibly unstable at around about, I think it was 34.2 degrees Celsius. There was a long drawn out examination of this in the English High Court in the Aconcagua, and effectively at that temperature calcium hypochlorite changes from a rather benign powder into a self-heating time bomb, and it has a runaway self-heating property which will eventually lead to explosion and fire. And in most of these container ship cases, they have resulted in very serious casualties, because often the ships are in the middle of oceans, the fire spreads fairly easily. Safe carriage of calcium hypochlorite, what we are looking at is stowing away from heat sources. The Aconcagua was a heated bunker tank. Stowing away from direct sunlight, for example, I think it was the CMA Jakarta was hypochlorite in direct sunlight. So it is possible to containerize calcium hypochlorite and carry it safely. So we look at it and we say, is it just simply an unstable cargo, or is it actually a stowage issue? Then you rewind and you're looking at the question of whether or not it is a declaration issue. Has the cargo been appropriately declared to the forwarder, to the charterer, to the owner? There are a number of stages in the process whereby a declaration could go wrong and the container could end up in direct sunlight or in close proximity to a heat source. There's a very interesting casualty of 3 summers ago, the Charlotte Maersk, where there were containers of calcium hypochlorite on board, and I don't think it's contentious to say that the calcium hypochlorite was very close to the seat of the initial fire. However, the calcium hypochlorite in question was being carried in a reefer container. Now, at first blush, if you carry a calcium hypochlorite in reefer containers at 10 degrees C, where you have a chemical that becomes unstable at about 34 degrees C, you should have no problem. However, what happens if you have a reefer container that develops a fault and the reefer fails? It seems to me that you're actually then in a situation where you're carrying a time bomb, because the calcium hypochlorite is in an insulated box, and the slightest element of self-heating will become very quickly a runaway process. It's all pure speculation at this particular moment in time. We're waiting for a GA adjustment to be published. I think I can, even with my evangelical cargo hat, say that calcium hypochlorite is probably one of the examples where cargo alone does have the potential to cause a quite severe casualty. I've often joked with colleagues at Clyde's that if we were ever particularly short of casualty work, that we should start personally exporting dangerous chemicals out of China, and we might find there'd be a few more. Misdeclaration of container weights. The Napoli, 3 years of my life disappeared on the Napoli. It was a very interesting case. It was particularly high profile in the UK, because I don't know whether you saw it on the TV here, but when the containers were washed ashore, you had an awful lot of people driving from places like Liverpool and Essex to go and salve I think was the phrase that they used, the motorbikes or the oak wine barrels. And you now can't go into any pub in the southwest of England without finding lots of tables that were oak barrels that came off the Napoli. I do know where the motorbikes are, and BMW had them crushed. Very interestingly, the MAIB, the UK flag state inquiry, they carried out a forensic examination of the distribution of containers. There were 660 containers on the deck of the Napoli. 137 of them, so that's about 20%, had different weights to those that were declared. The total misdeclared weights add up to 312 metric tons. One container had a misdeclared weight of 20 tons higher than the weight declared. In addition, 7% of the containers on the deck were not in the position that MSC and the owners thought that they were. So you look at that, and instantly lots of people started saying, as they have with the More Comfort, oh, it must be misdeclared container weights, people trying to reduce their freight, people trying to pull a fast one on the forwarders. The reality of the situation is that actually an awful lot of people who stuff containers are guessing what the weights that they're stuffing the container with. They're working it out based on back of envelope calculations, working it out how many pallets they have, what each individual widget weighs, what individual boxes weigh, and it's not surprising that a large number are incorrect and there is problems with paperwork. The other thing is that across an entire container ship, if a certain number of containers are overweight, there's also likely to be a number of containers that are underweight. Across the whole vessel, it's actually likely to average itself out. Now on the Napoli, BMW and VW between them had 400 containers. VW South Africa had to shut down a week for a month for 6 months because they were short of spare parts. And it was on that liner service. And the one nightmare scenario that we had was that it was BMW or VW who had got it spectacularly wrong. But let's put it this way, when we looked at it closely, we found that those pesky Germans, they got it exactly spot on, and not a single one of their containers was misdeclared, which I think you would expect coming out of Germany. So we say enough to cause a catastrophic hull failure? No, not really. The MAIB came to the conclusion that it was some form of design issue. They said it must have been a freak wave to break the back of that ship, and they did a load of work with DMV. This is all in the public domain, so I'm not telling tales out of school here. But DMV produced a computer program, a computer modelling of the casualty, and when the vessel broke her back, DMV had worked out that the vessel needed to be hit by a 23-metre wave. Now in my book that's a tsunami, and last time I looked the south of England was not flooded. And believe me, DMV actually modelled it and said to break the back of this vessel you require a 23-metre wave. Literally both ends of the ship out of the water, snap. And of course the most interesting thing of all was all of the fishermen, the Cornish fishermen, all reported not seeing a wave of that magnitude. Something else must have done it. The Angelin, very briefly, this was a vessel coming out of a Caribbean port, mill pond conditions. She sailed about 500 metres out of port and promptly capsized and sank. And again, that is a case where the ship owners said, oh, well, you know, we've done a lot of research and a load of the containers are misdeclared. As it turned out, it was a chief officer who had been with the vessel a week, hadn't been trained on the stability program, and set sail with water above his plimsoll lines. Again, I always take with a pinch of salt when people say, oh, it must have been something to do with the container weights. I'm going over there again. Speed over safety. By and large, the container industry is designed for speed. It's designed for speed in order to reduce freight costs. By keeping freight costs under control, what essentially the United States and Western Europe has been able to do 25, 30 years ago was subcontract out to the Far East the vast majority of production of day-to-day goods. And if you think about the price that you pay in the shop now, for those who are old enough to remember buying clothes in the 80s, the clothes we bought back then were pretty much the same price as they are now, by and large. Electronic consumer goods are cheaper now than they were then. Containerization and reduced freight rates as a result has allowed the West, originally the West, to have its goods produced in other parts of the world on a cheaper basis. So you need to minimize the costs of carriage. That is going to inevitably have an impact on safety issues. Now, from a cargo perspective, every time anyone says to me, oh, it must have been cargo's fault, you didn't weigh your container, you didn't get your calculations, your declarations right, I always turn around and say, well, oh, I've got somebody's iPhone on the... I can tell you, I'll tell you an amusing story about something similar to that on a big casualty where we got a disclosure order for the ship's hard drive and all of the internet traffic on board the ship. And when we accessed the chief officer's file, I've never seen so much pornographic material in my life. I had to take my female assistant off the case for a couple of weeks while we did the disclosure exercise, and I had to do it personally. Who has the last opportunity, sorry, I'm going out of the camera shot, who has the last opportunity in a port of loading to weigh containers? The carrier. After all, those modern container cranes could weigh every single container as it goes on the ship. What you have is a situation where the carriers say, we will rely on the declarations that are given to us, we will turn a blind eye, we won't take the opportunity of weighing just to check. Now, if you think through the logic of it, the vast majority of containers are packed and stuffed well away from the port. They're delivered to the port as FCL boxes, and the last thing a carrier wants is to have a box on a container crane, and the crane driver says, oh, wait a minute, this one's meant to be 18 tons and it's 24 tons. I'm going to raise the alarm, because the next thing you know, the whole loading and stowage of a container ship has become a problem, and the carrier will have to go away and rewrite their plan and start from scratch, and that might involve actually unloading part and loading again. I can tell you another case involving a container ship casualty where we saw a document from the managers where they were questioning the fact that the ship had stopped to effect a main engine repair, and they were read the Riot Act and told, you do not stop without our permission. You're already 7 days behind schedule. You must keep up with your schedule. You must speed up and do everything you can to make up lost time. P.S. Don't do anything to endanger the safety of the ship, it said at the bottom. You look at dangerous goods. What are you going to do in terms of FCL boxes there has to be some level of trust as to what is being declared. I think it's a very different thing with the container weights, when weighing them would be relatively straightforward, but you can't really expect a carrier to open up every single box and check the declaration and see what he's carrying. I've lost my whizzy thing. Oh, okay. Just to conclude, let's just have a look at the future. You all probably recall the outcry that followed the US suggesting that every single container was going to require opening and inspecting just in case an Al-Qaeda operative was inside. And the cost level that would be involved in that. And, you know, taking a step back and taking my cargo hat off, the one thing I can say is containerisation means that goods are as cheap as they are in the shops. And where do you draw the line, and where do you stop introducing further checks in terms of what is in containers and what are the weights of it? I don't know what the answer is, but one thing we have joked about in England on a regular basis is, you've all seen these new Maersk supercarriers, the Emma Maersk and the Cape Maersk, and they can carry 14, 16, and then 18,000, I think was launched the other week. We always joke that if one of those supercarriers were to break in half and sink in late November on its way into Felixstowe, Christmas would be cancelled. There would be no goods in the shop because of the sheer amount of goods that are now produced halfway around the world and brought to us. And the scary thought is the Napoli, when she was built in 1992, was the biggest container ship ever launched, capable of carrying 4,200 TEUs. The Comfort is capable of carrying 8,400 and was only half full and still have more than the Napoli could have carried. You think what it's going to be like when the Emma or the Cape Maersk have a serious box fire or run aground or break their backs. Potentially they'll be the first unsalvable vessels.